We are going to start. So, Bruchim Habaim, welcome. I'm so delighted everybody's here, and I'm so excited for this conversation with Rabbi Kolodny, who I can no longer see. Oh, there you are. You shifted around on my screen. With Rabbi Debra Kolodny. And so this is part of a series, a nascent series that is called The Space Between Us. And for a long time, I just love talking to people about theology and Torah and how it informs their lives and all the different approaches that that people have, and different rabbis especially who center their lives around these texts and ideas have. And so originally I wanted to do like a podcast where I would go around town and interview different rabbis and record it and then throw it up online, which I might still do one day. But in the meantime, I just realized as we all started taking advantage of this technology that had been around us for so long, but it seems like we really didn't start to use it in a way that we were seeking fluency until the COVID business started. So I just jumped on it, and a few weeks ago, Rabbi Tzvi Fisher and I sat down and talked. I think many of you were on that conversation, and that was really wonderful and illuminating. And I have Rabbi Kolodny and I have had chance to sort of bounce ideas off one another, because we both are teachers, as are many, or all of the rabbis, almost all the rabbis in Portland are teachers in the Intro to Judaism class, which is a wonderful wonderful opportunity to connect. But she and I both have done the panel presentation in that class that is focused on the different movements in Judaism. And so I've had a chance to hear her talk a little bit about where she comes from and what she's about and what animates her. And this felt like, I just wanted to delve in a little more and get to know this person who I admire a lot and who walks the walk and is a heavy hitter in terms of her ideas and teaching, and is an original kind of thinker. I'm very attracted to rabbis who are not your grandmother's rabbi, or not your grandfather's rabbi, but also rabbis who are, just who walk the walk and who come from an interesting place. And so I thought, hey, I wanted to talk to this person a little more. So I'm not going to give the official bio, but I will just say that many of you know Rabbi Kolodny from the Portland's Unshul, and you know her from around town as a Torah teacher and as a creative liturgist, formerly the rabbi at Pnei Or, Congregation Pnei Or, where she made a big impact on the lives of a lot of people. And also is just a teacher around town. So I'm delighted to have this person with us, this rabbi, this teacher with me. And I told her that my vision for tonight is that I want it to be like she and I are sitting down having a drink, and we're just schmoozing and getting to go deep on these topics, and that we have a bunch of folks who are here with us, and who are listening, and hopefully folks will ask questions of us later. We'll pause in the conversation to let you do that. And if we do that, it'll be good, and we'll go to deep and real and true places. So that is the goal for tonight. And one other prefatory word, and then we're just going to jump in, and that is that last time with Rabbi Fisher, I think I paused to let people ask questions. And I was surprised. It was a great conversation and people dug it, but I was surprised that people were very hesitant to ask questions, maybe because you feel embarrassed or self-conscious in front of so many other people. But I want to really, really encourage you to ask questions, and ask hard questions. Challenge us a little bit, or tell us to go somewhere in the convo where we're not going. So it helps us if you don't hold back when we pause to ask questions. So, Rabbi Kolodny, I want to turn to you, and I'll ask a question, but I haven't really given you a chance to do any introduction of yourself or to say hello. So if you want to do that first, you're welcome to. But I will just start by asking you, what's up with the Unshul? Why did you start the Unshul? Why does it have that name? And you should not assume, of course, that everybody here knows what the Unshul is at all. But what's that about, and what made you want to do that? And welcome.
Well, by first, just a wee bit of introduction. I know it's hard when people change their pronouns, but I don't use she and her. My pronouns are they and them. I've recently fully embraced my non-binary identity, and there's Torah behind that, so I could tell the Torah
Great.
too. But 5 years ago or so, I was looking around at the Portland Jewish scene, and I asked myself, what might be an interesting addition? There's a great shul in there's great congregations in every flavor of Judaism, but what might be interesting for people? I had been saying for years, people do not come to Portland to be Jewish. You know, if you want to have a thriving Jewish community with lots of kosher restaurants and lots of synagogue options, you go to LA, you go to New York, you go even to Chicago or DC. But Jews come here for other reasons, for relationships or jobs or the beautiful Pacific Northwest rainforest or the environmental consciousness or the political leftiness. And so focusing in on those things, or the spiritual but not religiousness, focusing on all of the things I thought are kind of quintessentially Portland, I said, well, why don't I offer a bunch of definitely Jewish opportunities, but aligned with why a lot of people come here. And so I identified maybe 10 different offerings I think we started out with. One was Shabbos morning Torah hike, where we would daven in the woods for an hour, and then we would take a walk in the woods, and I would construct questions that I thought the woods could answer that were applicable to that week's Torah portion. And we had a dance davening service. Oh yes, sacred dance is so big here. So we had a Havdalah dance davening service. It was a Mincha Havdalah service. And I'd give a very brief kavanah for the dance. And then we would do just like high energy dance music. I had a band with your friend, Michael Sasno. And we would then at the end of the service unpack what Torah our body taught us as we moved through the music in relationship with the prayer.
So can I I'm getting you midstream, but can I ask you about that? So first of all, I'm sorry for not using the proper pronouns, and if I screw that up, I ask for your indulgence and invite you to correct me. It's a habit I'm still working on, still trying to open myself to getting my brain to think outside of those categories. So, so tell me, because for a lot of people, including myself, that relationship of the body to Torah is not, it's not so familiar. And so tell me, how do you think about, I get the joy of it, and I can totally even see it being illuminating and learning from it, and I've, in my own ways, for my own reasons, I've thought a lot about embodiment and embodiedness and how that relates to spiritual practice. But I don't think of that as being Jewishly rooted or Jewishly sourced. So can you tell me maybe why I think that, and why so many people make that assumption that it's not, if that is incorrect, and then tell me, what's the Jewish anchor for you?
My guess is that most people in the United States have been Christianized, and Christianity has a very serious separation between body and soul. Soul good, body bad. And there's lots of degradation of the body and denigration of the body. And that's not a Jewish construct at all. The body, the goof, is holy as the neshama. And we are to do all kinds of important things around the body, eat kashrut. So we're supposed to nourish ourselves in ways that are holy. And for some conservative Jews and many Orthodox Jews engage in Taharat HaMishpacha, the family purity laws. We will go into mikvah. Women will go into mikvah after their period is fully over. And so I would even say the laws of quarantine that we recently read about that are so applicable to the plague we're experiencing today are all about ensuring that we maintain the holiness of the vessel of the body and separate ourselves out if we might be contagious. But the whole point of the separation is to bring people back in, right? So rather than fear the body, I think Judaism as a tradition, Torah as a teaching, invites us to lift up the beauty of the body and celebrate the body. And then there's all kinds of teachings, excuse me if this offends anybody, but the double mitzvah on Shabbat. We're supposed to make love with our partner on Shabbat. So we're very, very embodied.
Right.
Where in our practice does dance come in? Well, the Hasidic tradition, which is the undergirding tradition of Jewish renewal, which is where I locate myself, of course, is an ecstatic prayer tradition,
Right.
and dance is ubiquitous
Right.
in the Hasidic tradition. So all of those are kind of proof texts and proof experiences, I guess, for the body as both a sacred entity and also as a vehicle for ecstatic, to use during ecstatic prayer.
Right, right. So the first part I definitely got, the first part about the body being a vessel of holiness and the different, embodied traditions, which is so obviously woven into Judaism, like so much mitzvah has to do with the body. That part I did get. But I hadn't thought of I was really asking about the body as a source or as a vehicle for spiritual insight. So tell me, walk us through because I don't think I'm alone in the Zoom call, not having done this with you. What did this look like? Walk us through a moment in this ecstatic dance and what would come out of that? What might come out of that for a person?
Well, thank you. First of all, in addition to the tradition within Judaism of the body being holy and prayer dance being ecstatic and something to be explored, I also was regular at local ecstatic dance services, and I studied up on the founder of ecstatic dance, Gabriel Roth, who had a 5 rhythms theory of everything. The theory of everything, was it Ken Wilber? I don't know. But anyway, she had a 5 rhythms theory of the world, that everything could be described that as either coming from stillness or lyricism or staccato, kind of angry,
right.
harsh
Heard
energy.
of this. Yeah.
And she would design musical experiences that would take people from stillness back to stillness through the whole arc of these 5 rhythms as a therapeutic experience, and as an experience where one could get in touch with oneself. So I combined what existed in Judaism with the knowledge and wisdom of Gabriel Roth, and I designed a flow of the music using shul tunes, that I didn't write original music, that would take us from stillness and meditative energy into ecstatic kind of energy. And I would start each of the services, as I mentioned, with a kavanah, with an intention, and invite specific body movements. So it's been a long time since I've done this, but let's say Parshat Yitro, where Moshe Rabbeinu is having an encounter with his father-in-law, Yitro. There is a choreography of their connecting in that Parsha, where Moshe Rabbeinu sees Yitro, he prostrates himself, he kisses Yitro, right. And so I invite people to actually do those movements through the course of the prayer. There's a couple of more movements. And then at the end of the service, say, what does your body teach you, by opening up to, an invisible other with embrace and respect and openness and gratitude. And people would articulate the most amazing Torah.
Right, because through enacting it and with their bodies, it's changing their perceptions or their ideas, or ideas are coming up in ways that they wouldn't without the body movements. Exactly. You're saying, yeah, wow, that's powerful. So I want to, I don't know, 2 different thoughts, and one is that I do think that. And by the way, I love it. I'm into it. It sounds very cool. It's definitely not the zone where I'm comfortable. I'm very kind of uptight in my body, but I dig it, and I'm very interested. I mean, I love what you're talking about. I'm very interested in the idea that, for sure, and have been in touch with the different ways that being more embodied and being more attuned to your body does change your consciousness. And so I love what you're saying. I also think, and maybe I can figure out a way to put these 2 points together. I sort of reject the idea that a lot of people have, that Judaism does not believe in the body soul split. Um, I feel like in a lot of Hasidic and Kabbalistic teaching and a lot of rabbinic writing, I haven't thought about it as much in the Torah. I feel like we do have that split where the soul is privileged over the body, and the body, though it's treated differently than in Christianity for sure, because it is ultimately a creation of God and therefore it's holy, and we have a totally different relationship than Christianity does to the body. That I do feel like that split exists. So, but
I
whatever.
jump in?
That's yeah. Please.
I mean, you certainly would find proof for that in the Chabad world, the 5 levels of the soul, where
Yeah.
nefesh, the body level, is the lowest level, right?
Yeah.
And yichud is the highest level. Yichudah is the highest level,
Yeah.
where it's, union with
Yeah.
Hashem, and it's all pure spirit, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I don't disagree. You can find proof text for that, but
Yeah.
I also see that Judaism is a tradition in conversation with itself.
Yeah.
And so I guess I just opt in.
Right to that side of it.
Yeah.
Yep. And then the question, and Rabbi Fisher and I talked about this as well, because this is such an interesting, a very almost an obsession for me. So allow me a digression, because last time I didn't really, when I talked with Rabbi Fisher about it, I sort of tried to explain to people where my question was coming from. So let me set this up. What I want to ask you about is, so you were talking about about the ways in which you reached outside of the Jewish tradition to the ecstatic dance and wove it together to help, so they would inform one another, and you sort of folded it in ways that you articulated beautifully, and the idea is very beautiful. One of the great struggles of my Jewish life, and I mean struggle in a good way, but also very intense, has been the search, which the search for Jewish authenticity, and I'm putting it in air quotes because I understand that the concept is in itself problematic and not everybody accepts it. But so my path into Judaism as an adult was an attempt to find an anchor that would give me a countercultural perspective on the America of the 1970s and 80s that I grew up with, and even on the Jewish world of the 70s and 80s that I grew up with, which is a world that I found to be, it's so hard to talk about this stuff in Portland, having grown up in Portland as the rabbi's son at a shul. But I mean, I just speak frankly, because I spoke frankly with my dad and about this and other people. I found aspects of the Jewish world to be deeply materialistic and counter to the values that I heard my father talking about on the Bima. And so my path forward in Judaism was to give myself a kind of countercultural perspective, and therefore, not always with great wisdom, I was sort of interested on whether ideas were coming from within the tradition or from outside of the tradition. And I think self-reflective enough to know that over time that boundary became, I came to see it as a little forced and artificial, and that one can make the argument that there was never a moment at which Judaism was, totally isolated from the culture around it. And I do understand that. Having said that, I guess I just want to ask you, maybe how do you think about what those boundaries are as we think about the relationship of our culture to the culture around it? How do we know what is okay, and even more than okay, important to bring in? And how do we know what are the things that we want to say, that's antithetical to the values of our culture?
Mm-hmm. I remember when I was first connecting with Jewish Renewal, and there were teachers who identified as Buddhist Jews, who were saying they were teaching basically Vipassana meditation and calling it Jewish, and I almost vomited. I was so allergic to that. so offended by that syncretism, because it didn't seem mindful and it didn't seem authentic. And I remember once I went to a friend's wedding, and the presiding rabbi, the officiating rabbi, anointed the beloveds, on their ear and on their and replicating the priestly anointment. But she didn't go there. Where the rabbi went was, and this is what the Chinese acupuncture points are for all of this. What are you doing? We have so much practice. Why are you going there? So I'm saying this to join with you.
Yeah.
That I have had, years of allergy to that kind of stuff. And what's also true in terms of the Jewish renewal lineage is that there's a very strong teaching that, look, we integrate philosophy, we have historically integrated philosophy and anthropology and sociology and psychology and knowledge of healing. All of these things have, over the years, like the state-of-the-art knowledge has been integrated into Judaism. So for me, if I'm integrating knowledge about the body into Judaism that comports with or aligns with how Judaism already sees the body, that feels like just, I'm getting with the, I'm getting current.
Right.
That's what that feels like. And therefore that feels authentic.
Right.
But if I'm leading, Jewish meditation was another one of the things I threw up on the wall to see how it would go with the unsure. But if I'm leading Jewish meditation, I promise you, I'm leading Abraham Abulafia, Kavanot, and I am teaching the Sfirot, and I am teaching Yud-He Vav-He meditations, right? I'm teaching Jewish meditation.
Right.
That's how I draw the line. It's like if I am either doing something or teaching something where we have a rich, amazing, scope of knowledge, that's what I'm teaching.
Right.
The things I add are just like modern, maybe one could say secular, additions. That being said, Jewish mysticism is unbelievably informed by Sufism, right?
Right.
There's little to distinguish it in some ways. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's right. There's a lot of crossover, and and this is in some ways a real dividing point on this topic, real dividing point between the movements. We don't usually talk about it in this way, but this is a little bit of an aside for people who may not know the background on this, but one of the breaking points in Jewish history between modernity and everything that came before it was the study of history. And the more one studies history, the more, at least initially, disillusioning or upsetting it can be, because you come to understand that what you had thought were these very stark boundaries, like around the tower, these reinforced walls guarding the Jewish tradition throughout history, as you study history, it becomes much harder to hold that view. Even for those who have studied ancient history, and you see some like flood stories in the ancient Middle East that precede the flood story of the Torah, it just becomes really hard to hold on to the notion that Judaism has always been completely isolated and separate. So I do accept that. And the reason that I think the struggle is so important is, as obviously I'm sure you acknowledge, is, I think Reb Zalman is a great example of this. Reb Zalman was an unbelievable, and maybe you can talk a little bit about Reb Zalman's influence on you and your love for him. But, Reb Zalman, for those who didn't know Reb Zalman of blessed memory, his ability to do precisely what Rabbi Debra is talking about in such innovative and courageous ways, and to draw practices and insights from other traditions into a deeply authentic Jewish, web or whatever the word would be, was just so Matrix. Incredible. Matrix. Right. Thank you. I'm completely down with that and interested in it, and I see its value. But the reason there's so much at stake in this conversation is that there are people, and always have been people, who will draw in values that we maybe wouldn't think are so positive from the surrounding culture and say, this is a Jewish value, whether it be, materialism or militarism or something else, and they'll become apologists for this particular secular worldview by finding evidence in the Jewish tradition. So, the boundaries, the concern with boundaries on this issue is not just one where of my own obsessive desire to find some rich, pure Judaism just for the sake of doing it. It's because I do think that there's a danger um, uh, because there are people who will try to, distort Jewish values by bringing in values that are corrosive from the outside world. Obviously, I'm not suggesting at all that you're doing that. I'm just saying this is why it's an issue of concern to me. So
Yeah, I think the rubric of Avodah Zarah really covers that for me. So the
right,
question is, are you worshiping something other than God? So
right,
materialism is totally covered by that.
right,
So is militarism.
right,
So frankly is assimilation.
right,
The
right,
urge to be accepted, is basically worshiping the culture at large, right?
right.
As opposed to God. So yeah. So
That's
I would
great.
say
That's helpful.
I use that as a lodestar. Is that the word? I don't know. Guiding star.
I like Lodestar. Sounds cool. It sounds like some navigation system on a Buick, but I like
And
it.
I don't even know what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know what it is, but it sounded right. Yeah, no, that's great, and that's actually perfect, right? That of course would be the test case. I wasn't thinking in those terms, but that's right. Is it a Avodah Zarah? And obviously, different people are going to have different answers to that, but that's beautiful. Okay, I'm gonna pause here just because this feels like a nice little pausing point, and just see if there are questions that people want to shoot, or Rabbi Kolodny or myself, or a direction you want us to go in, because I have a million other questions for her, but if I want to open it to the floor. If you have a hand up or chat it up, you can send a chat. Hold on, I'm seeing something in the chat. Oh, okay, that's just from Jemmy inviting you to talk. Okay, so will you tell us, because I do want us to get to, as we talked earlier in advance of our meeting here tonight, I do want to talk about what's going on in our world around us, because I think that's an important thing that's obviously been on my mind and in the mind of anybody who takes their Yiddishkeit seriously, certainly on yours, I know. But before we go there, will you tell us a little bit about what Reb Zalman meant to you, and why you were attracted to Jewish renewal in particular?
Yeah. I came into my Jewish observance late in life. Unlike you, I was not raised by a rabbi. I was raised by parents who I like to call secular wolves. I was raised by wolves. They were secular. And they made a God out of no God. So they were so profoundly attached to their atheism that was the only possible understanding of the world. And I went to Israel when I was 16 on an exchange program, and I had what I understood to be an encounter with God at the Kotel when I was 16. And it totally changed my whole worldview. But then I was a wandering Jew for quite a while. I was a senior in high school when I went to Israel. I went off to college, and I didn't know what to do with my newfound awakening. And so I just studied a lot, and I started playing rugby. I played rugby on Shabbos during college. And so I continued to wander through law school. And then it took until I did study some Hebrew and study some scripture, but it was very minimal. I was also exploring all kinds of other things. So I was exploring Quakerism. Quakers really did it for me, because the experience I had of God's presence, it was very Buberian, when I was at the Kotel, was the experience I had at a Quaker meeting, that the silence was so thick with Godness. So I was very attracted to being there. I was there for 4 years in my late 20s. And then I realized, oh my gosh, I am Jewish and these people are not. And I just need to find this in Judaism, right? So the portal to my Jewishness.
Well, sorry, but you're, just to understand that your parents were very, very secular, but they were very into their Yiddishkeit, right?
Right. So the values that we were politically left, and I had to get as much education as I possibly could, and everyone was a unionist, and I wasn't quite a red diaper baby. I'm too young for that, but that kind of
Yep.
Jewish environment.
Got
And I
it.
lived in New York, where the owner of the corner bodega was Jewish. It's like Jewish is in the water,
Right.
right?
And when you're born in New York, you actually have to opt out of being Jewish. If you don't say anything, you're just Jewish
I have to work
automatically.
so hard to not
Right.
be Jewish. Exactly.
Right.
So I had the cultural identity, cultural, political, sociological identity, and then I had this mystical experience. And so my gateway into spirit was meditation. And it took me I was 16 when I had this first experience. It took me until my mid-30s to find myself in a Jewish community, to push myself to go to a Jewish community.
Mm-hmm.
And I landed in a community that was a chavara that was not renewal, but all the chavarot kind of had a little renewal flavor. And
Right.
a couple years later, somebody turned me on to Eilat Chaim, which was the Jewish Renewal Retreat Center. And there I got to study with some of the best teachers in the Jewish renewal world. And I got introduced to this paradigm that Jewish renewal lives in. And it was very early on in my exploration that I heard, either I read or I heard Reb Zalman say himself about something about the God field. And then everything broke open for me, because that understanding of God cosmology, that God was like a field, let's say, of electricity, could also be the apple orchard field, but a field of electricity where everything is connected and healing can be transmitted and wisdom and prophecy and health, everything could be transmitted.
Right.
It's exactly what my experience had been at the Kotel when I had that.
So can you talk a little bit about those mystical experiences? You described it as being Bubarian, and I just help. Like, what was that experience? What did it feel like? What was it? I know those are hard to describe by nature, but what is this experience, and how did it connect to Zalman's metaphor of the God field?
So I went up to the Kotel, and this experience has been replicated many times, but this was the first one, so it's quite profound. I knew that we were invited to write a prayer and put it into the crack in the wall, so I did that. Didn't know what prayer was. I'd never prayed in my life. I didn't know what to do with myself, so I just tried to get still, really just get still, and be present, fully present. And it was within 30 seconds or maybe 60 seconds, I had this experience of the air around me getting thick with sentience, with consciousness. So I was enveloped by a consciousness, right? And I didn't want to have a conversation with this consciousness. I didn't have the need for that. It was pure, I vow, it was pure relationship. And the presence stayed with me until I decided I was done, which was maybe 15 minutes. I kind of I could tolerate that intensity of experience. And when I decided to leave, somebody must have told me you need to back away from the wall. I don't know how I knew to back away from the wall. That was pretty trippy, not turn my back on the wall. But I remember very distinctly saying that my parents are wrong. This is God. This is what God is. Sorry about the dog. Can you hear it? Is she really loud?
Oh yeah.
Hold on a second.
I love this. We have to learn the dog's name as soon as you're unmuted.
Cinnamon.
Cinnamon.
When I go there, she does quiet down. So actually, hold on a second.
Okay. So I want to, as Rabbi is talking to Cinnamon, I'll just say that 15 minutes, I don't know, I was going to ask people to raise their hands, but most people don't have their faces showing. I was going to ask what's the longest you've ever held on to a mystical experience? I've never, I've had different mystical experiences, but I've never held on to something for that's a long time to be able to dwell in that state of consciousness. That's a real gift.
And it was
you were
pure,
given.
It was pure grace. So I like to, so since then I've developed many theories about spiritual, about the elevation of consciousness. There's those moments that come by virtue of grace, I didn't have a practice. I wasn't meditating. I wasn't training my mind. And then there's the experiences that some people meditate for 50 years and they never have such an experience, right? And my belief is, though, that the more you entrain yourself through meditation and other ecstatic practices, the more likely, the more potential there is for the intersection of grace and practice to
Right.
allow for deep, deep experience. Anyway, so what I'll say a few more things. I felt the air felt like a comforter or something, it's like that level of not stifling, just like
Right.
comfy,
But like sensible, like you were feeling something, like
absolutely.
literal, like pressing on you kind of.
It was a sensory
Yeah.
experience.
Sensory. Yeah.
And it was absolutely sentient. It
Yeah.
had awareness and consciousness.
Hmm.
So I went chasing after that, which is why the Quakers were so fantastic, because I used to say they would draw down the God field. And then I encountered Reb Zalman, and he was talking about the God field, and I was like, whoa, blew my mind.
The God field being like the space that's between people, being part of the relational experience of God.
And I would say actually the everything, the all that is,
Yeah.
the Sof, that without end.
Yeah.
All we need to do is turn our gaze or shift the channel that our mind is on to feel it, to see it and feel it and know it.
Right. Wow. Really beautiful. Yeah. So I had my experience of Reb Zalman, and I don't want to belabor this because I think I mentioned this in the last conversation. So when I lived in Boulder for many years, I was a rabbi in Boulder many years, as you know, and I studied with Reb Zalman and two other people. We had a weekly meeting and we read Derech HaMelech, and he was just such a profound thinker, such an unbelievable teacher, and so hard to describe his mind, so gentle and funny, but also so deep and profound and so nimble and clever and insightful and just so able to use metaphor and use like common, I don't even like objects in the world or to shed light on some very complex topic, or he would draw on scientific or technological concepts in order to illuminate some idea. So he made a huge impression on me, and but also I've come to realize over time so much of just what has been in the air of late 20th century and 21st century Judaism has been, knowingly or not, a direct or indirect result of Reb Zalman. That I would say everybody on this phone call, everybody on the Zoom call has been shaped by Reb Zalman. I think his importance, it's not yet clear. It has not yet been described properly. I think how important a thinker he is and how influential Reb Zalman was. So I don't know if I ever told you, my time in Boulder is so marked by Zalman, not only because Boulder in itself is so influenced by Jewish renewal and by Reb Zalman, but also I just so associated there because some of my most precious memories were learning with him, but also when I decided to leave Boulder, and he died 3 days after I left. So in my mind, it's like this chapter of my life is so connected to him. He's quite an important figure to me. So, okay, one other question, and then we'll turn.
I have to tell you, he loved to
yeah.
study Derech HaMelech.
Say it again. You have studied, or you would love to?
He loved to study it.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
what I studied with him.
Oh, is that right?
But not for years and years and years. Yeah. So you may know this, I don't, and some people know this, Cheryl knows this. I was the executive director at Aleph, the flagship organization of the Jewish Renewal Movement.
I did not know that.
For 9 years. And so I didn't just study with Reb Zalman, I ran his show.
Right.
And, so we had a very intimate collegial relationship.
That's so great. I didn't know that.
Programs on that highlighted him, and of course I was involved with programming for all of the 9 years. So we had an interesting and well-rounded relationship, much more so than most students of his.
Right. Well, that's how precious. That's great. I envy you that. That's an incredible way to get to know a person in a different way. Okay, so I keep threatening to turn the conversation to what's going on in Black Lives Matter, and I do want to do that. But I also wanted to take you up on the offer to, you said that you use the pronoun they, And so let's talk about whatever reasons you want to give for that, but also in particular, I'm interested in the sort of theological
Mhm.
or religious valence of that for you, because you alluded to that at the beginning, and I want to invite you to talk a little bit about what is that about.
Yeah. So before I was steeped in Judaism, when I was a dykeling, when I was coming out as a lesbian, um, in my late teens, I was a rugby playing hippie intellectual, right? So I had this like very interesting constellation of identities. And one of the things that was always true for me is that I was a long-haired hippie, right? But I was also this serious jock. And
Yeah.
so the juxtaposition of, which goes also to the embodiment piece of
Yeah.
my life. So, working out and pumping iron and tackling people and, being a kind of like tough, badass, was a very strong part of my identity. And but my appearance was also always on the, let's say in the community, we'd say femme side. And so I always identified as androgynous, but not in that way of like a cis woman looks like a guy
Right.
because she has really short hair and wears suits, right? But in a totally different way. So that was my like first understanding of my being outside of gender binaries. And I also came out as bisexual. And so in terms of my attraction to people, gender was not a variable that I took into account as to whether or not I found someone attractive. It was
Right.
the soul, right? So I've been living a life beyond gender since my late teens.
Mm-hmm.
Back then, we didn't have gender queer and non-binary as definitions of
Mm-hmm.
gender identity. And so over the years, I just always lived with that. And finally, I will say, hope this doesn't make anybody uncomfortable, but going through
Okay.
menopause really like put the nail on the head. It was like, all right, my hormones are changing and there's ways I'm in relationship with my embodiment that are really profoundly do not feel female, do not feel like I'm a woman anymore.
Because of the process of menopause, or because of after having gone through it?
Well, after having gone through it, the hormonal shift, where I
Right.
landed in my hormonal shift,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So reduced estrogen, whatever. So I had always had this identity as being mixity and a mixity. And then the hormonal shift in menopause really profoundly, like I was like, all right, I really cannot say that I identify as a woman anymore. So
Right. Right.
that's the chronological kind of history of Deb as a human. The theological piece, which I had been teaching for years, is that the creation story, the first creation story, is that Hashem created Adam, the first being, not man, but earth being, both Zachar u'Nekava, both male and female.
Right.
And this being, which was singular, was also called them. And that was the being that was created Tselem Elohim, so B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. And so theologically, I had always had a sense that those of us who were open to transcending cisgender categories, were open to being in the in between or outside those categories, were actually living an aspiration to be as close to God-like as possible. And
Mm-hmm.
it's our Jewish tradition, Musar, to like try and get as close to godliness as possible, right?
Right.
Cultivate all of those, the emanations of the stirot, and also cultivate qualities. So, so I had already embraced that theology. Not that non-binary people are better than other people, but just that it's a spiritual project. Just like I want to cultivate my menuchat nefesh, my, quietude and
Right.
peacefulness. I wanted to cultivate being transcending gender as a limiting or designating variable, because God is beyond gender.
Right.
How was I constraining myself? Yeah.
Right. So that they're in by looking to that so, and for those who don't know, um, there are two stories about the creation of humanity in the book of Genesis, and that is what Rabbi Kolodny is referring to. And in one of them, the one that's probably better known by school children, well, and by many of us, Chava is taken from the tzela, from the rib of Adam. But in the other one, that's not, they are created as a them, I guess is how you would say it. And so it's interesting because I've actually never heard somebody point that out, but it's so right. And actually, do you remember the chapter and verse? Is it late in chapter 1? Because I could pull it up.
27.
127.
I think so.
So, because I want to share it with people so you can see what Rabbi Kolodny so beautifully, yeah, there it is. You're exactly right. Okay, so hold on. I'm going to share my screen. Those who learn with me are like rolling their eyes in trepidation and anxiety right now because I have so many troubles doing this correctly, but I'm going to do it and just show you because what Rabbi Kolodny is talking about is so interesting and deep.
And by the way, while you're doing that, I want to add that this is not like a 21st century radical feminist leftist queer understanding of this text. Midrash Rabbah Vayikra unpacks this as the first being was created androgynos, both male and female.
Right, using the Greek word, borrowed word, but so you're saying the midrash. So the midrash is ancient. I don't know exactly the dates of Midrash Rabbah, but we're talking about a text that's at least 2,000 years old, probably a little bit older than that. You're saying views this text in the same way as you just described it. Okay, so here's the text, and will you just walk us through this? Why you said that the text itself refers to them, as they. Yeah.
So Vayivra Elohim, and God created et ha'adam, the earthling, B'Tselmo, in God's image. That's a sick, because I call God they, not him. So it's problematic in the, grammar. B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. Bara Oto, God created. Oto is singular, him or it.
It, right.
Yeah. Zachar, male, unekava, and female, bara otam, created them.
Right. So what's so fascinating, and everyone here has to like rise up and shut me down if I go into like a textual wormhole, as I sometimes am prone to do, because I could just talk about this forever. But what's so beautiful so here, this last word otam, as Rabbi Kolodny just said, this means them. It's the direct object of them. So bara, he created. Obviously, God doesn't have a gender, as Rabbi Kolodny said, and as we all know, but in the Hebrew is a gendered language. He created otam, them. And what's fascinating and kind of fits, I think, with what you're saying, Rabbi Kolodny, in such interesting ways, is that it's this mix of singular and plural pronouns, right? God created, and oto means him or it. God created it, that is the earthling. And here the translation of earthling is appropriate because here Adam just means from the earth, Adam means earth, and so, or Adama means earth. So this is earthling. It sounds funny to us because we think of earthling as like a science fiction term that an alien calls a human, but it really is an earthling. Created it, singular. And then it says male and female created them. So that's what Rabbi Kolodny was alluding to. But just to be clear, this is kind of cool, or I don't know, I think worth reflecting on. It's not like you were waiting for the Torah to give you permission, right? It's just post facto, this verse resonates with you in a way that maybe it hadn't before. Right. Interesting. Really
and powerful. In fact, before I really embraced the identity of being non-binary, I used this particular pasuk, this particular passage, in my in queer Torah, to basically say, if each one of us is doing our cultivation, our soul cultivation work, and we're recognizing and embracing and cultivating our gender wholeness, our maleness and our femaleness, not whether we identify as non-binary or not, but just cultivating those qualities, then it doesn't matter if the person we're attracted to has an innie or an outie. If they're cultivating their wholeness and we're cultivating our
Right.
wholeness, then all relationships make sense.
Right. 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 Powerful. Um, the other, the other thing I want to say, and this, I was going to say this way back in when we were talking about the body and soul distinction in the Jewish tradition, but it fits here as well. The Kabbalists talk about, and specifically the Kabbalah of Yitzhak Luria in the 16th century talks about a structure, the like the world out, the kind of cosmic field out of which our current world emerged is referred to as Adam Kadmon, primordial earthling, usually translated as primordial man, but primordial Adam Kadmon. We are living in Adam Kadmon right now, in a way that we can't ever perceive, and we can't go off the rails on a Kabbalah trip right now, but the entire structure of the universe is modeled upon a human, and though it is called Adam, and we therefore assume that it is a man, it's really just on the primal being that has no gender. And exactly what that means we can't talk about here, but it's essentially the metaphor that that everything we've ever talked about on Kabbalah, we're only talking about the reflection of the light of Adam Kadmon, this primal being, in the shape of man, or excuse me, in the shape of a human, that is at the heart of the Kabbalistic project. So I wanted to get that in there because it's genderless.
Mm-hmm.
And as the Kabbalists talk about it, Adam Kadmon at least does not have a gender.
I also
Okay.
want to say that, that many people probably already know that the spherotic map is frequently implanted on our body, and one side of the spherotic map is considered male and another side is
Right.
considered female. But then what is Tiferet and Yesod? I mean, the line that's down the center body, right, is an integration of the masculine and feminine aspects, and even, yeah, so it's Kabbalah is interesting. Some people like deride it as being overly gendered, but I
Right.
actually think that it creates interesting gender possibilities.
I would love to talk to you about that sometime, because I definitely have the, not that I'm like opting this over this. I just haven't been exposed. For me, Yesod is
Yeah,
Yesod.
Alice.
Let's leave it. Yeah, that's what I was looking for. So I'd love to talk to you about that sometime. But okay, now let us talk about this. So, um, our country is going through something right now that one can either wring one's hands and be in despair about all of the things that have given rise to this moment of this outcry, or one can be very, very hopeful and inspired, as I am right now, as I've shared with my community. I'm filled with hope. But either way, anybody who knows Rabbi Kolodny knows that activism is a really, really deep part of who they are, and of their Judaism. And so this is just fundamental to Rabbi Kolodny. And I want to get a little bit to that. By the way, when I say activism, Rabbi Kolodny is not a Republican activist, and and also not a Democratic activist, but a radical activist. And so talk a little bit about the ways in which this, you talked about your family, and so it's clear that you kind of grew up with that in the air, but talk about why matters to you theologically and religiously. Where does this come from for you?
Mm. Well, everyone starts with tzedek tirdof, right? We're really supposed to pursue justice. And b'tselem Elokim, which I think is actually overused. We're all in the image of God, and so we need to, it's like the foundation of all Jewish human rights kind of consciousness. But I think maybe where I would start with Isaiah's description that we're to be an or lagoyim, we're supposed to be a light to the nations. And we are called to the highest level of consciousness and love and compassion and inclusivity possible. I mean, we have 36 times we're commanded to welcome the stranger and to invite them into our rituals, and invite them into our homes, and invite people who are different from us into celebration of our holy days. It's 36 times more than any other invitation / command. And so to me, that is really foundational. So we can't be who we are. We cannot be Jewish unless we are continually pursuing the kind of world that our prophets wanted us to pursue, which means that the hungry had to be fed, not, by the way, through charity, right? But through leaving the corners of the field and empowering them to help themselves. And the kind of world that Torah envisioned, where there could be no accumulation of wealth, because every 50 years wealth, returned to the original per capita distribution amongst the tribes.
In the Yovel year, in the Jubilee, for those who don't know what Rabbi is referring to.
So to me, like the whole, I've done a lot of guest preaching on Torah as the first intersectional guide to justice warriorship, right? So it's like, to me, that's what it is. Torah is a manual to pursue a world that celebrates and ensures that everyone can actualize their full potential, and that everyone gets healing, and everyone gets education, and everyone gets work, and
So why do you think it is then? Well, so let me say this. I grew up in for those who know my Abba, my dad was very, I would say, politically minded. He was not an activist in the Rabbi Kolodny mold. He had a very different approach, but there was no way to separate my Abba's Torah from his view of the political landscape and his desire to be a voice for justice. That was not my path. My path has changed a lot over the last couple of years, really, well, since 2016. But I've not, most of my where I come from in Torah is not that. So if everything you're saying is true, why is it the case that sounded like I'm setting up an argument against you? That's actually not at all what I'm doing. Why is it, if Judaism has at its core this prophetic call, like you mentioned Yeshayahu, and we could talk about Moses in Egypt, why is it that like normative Judaism in the United States is so often not about that? It's about study and tefillah, and you should be on the right side of the issues, but you don't need to be out like demonstrating, and it shouldn't take up that much of your time. You got to learn Mishnah and Gemara and all. How did that happen? What's your take on that? And is that a distortion of Yiddishkeit, or is that just another legitimate choice of how to be a Jew?
Well, I don't know if it's one or the other. I think it might be a predictable historical development for a people who had been ghettoized, outcast, not granted civil and civic rights for thousands of years, and just tried, and lived in galut, lived in exile, and so tried to recreate the sanctity of community wherever we were, and that meant that we were separate from the rest of the community. We were also not empowered for the vast majority of our history. There were little moments, in Egypt, and little moments here and there, but we were, for the most part, not empowered, and therefore we were not able to perform this role.
Right. We couldn't flex those political muscles, in a sense, is what you're saying.
Right. So we dug into what we could do, which was we could study our texts, and we could pray our prayers, and we could practice our mitzvot. And then what has emerged, in the last 80 years in this country over time was as Jews became white and Jews got access to educational opportunities and professional opportunities and gained some power, is that we now have the bandwidth, I think, to perform our prophetic role in the larger world, in the larger community.
Well, that's fascinating, because that points in a way that really what you're saying really I don't know what the word is. I was going to celebrates the United States, but it's actually much bigger than that. What you're saying is actually very profound in terms of because I think what you're saying is the situation of Jews being in America, where at least there's, like, I think we could all agree, some base minimum of democracy and ability to raise our voices up. You're saying actually presents this possibility of being out of a kind of exile galut consciousness, where we can actually activate these values that are in our tradition that for a couple of millennia just had to sort of lay latent. And so then Israel and the United States both become projects, I would imagine you would say, that Israel, where Jews can live out their values, at least have the possibility to put their values into the public square in a way they couldn't before.
And I would also say, I'm going to leave Israel for another conversation,
Yeah.
but I would also say Reb Zalman, Zichrono Livracha, would always use the metaphor that every tradition needs to have like a trunk of the tree that's very, very stable and unmoving and consistent, and that the Orthodox world, with its
Right.
keeping of the tradition of study and Talmud study and just practice, very high observance, is the trunk of our tree. But every tree also needs to have the growing edge, right? And so
Right.
we would liken renewal to the growing edge. And so even as some of us opt in to the political activism in the larger realm, that doesn't mean everybody has to, or if
Right.
you're not good or a good Jew, like there's different ways to be good Jews.
Right.
Rabbis, we actually have a question in the
okay,
chat.
let me. Okay, give me one more second, and then we'll turn to the chat.
Great, thank you.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that metaphor of the tree, because Rabbi Fisher and I were talking about in our conversation, talking about the relationship between the Orthodox and the non-Orthodox worlds, and just each describing it in different ways, the relationship. And I didn't feel satisfied with what I had said. And it wasn't until after I got off of the Zoom call that I remembered that magnificent metaphor that Reb Zalman used to talk about the Jewish people really functioning as a whole while recognizing the different parts, which I think is such an honest and true and beautiful and open way to look at it. Okay, what is our chatted question?
Okay, well, while we're talking about social activism and what's going on in terms of understanding anti-racism and our own role as Jews, Marilyn wants to know, what do you mean as Jews became white?
So as many are probably aware, the eugenicists Cinnamon, let me go get her. You take that ball.
Okay. So I think what Rabbi Kolodny means is that Jews for so long were marginalized, that we were not considered part of the norm. And so when Rabbi Kolodny says white, what they mean is the idea that the norm would be white. And as long as we were marginalized, we were not part of that normative culture. And eventually in the 19th and 20th centuries, really the 20th century, as Jews became upwardly mobile and kind of embraced by the broader culture, Jews became white. We became embraced by middle-class culture and middle-class values in so many ways. And we were seen as, in some ways, really embodying the American dream, and then became part of the norm, and in that way became white. What's interesting, what's interesting here is that, as I'm sure you've heard Eric Ward. So the first we have a speaker series called What's the Big Idea, in which I invite in an activist or a thinker, and we have different dialogues about different topics. And he was the kickoff for the speaker series. And among other many interesting and awesome things he said that night is he said that Jews are not white. So some of you may remember that, but I think I did a reasonable job of suggesting what you meant when you said Jews became white, but why don't you say it in your way?
Well, I want to say that one of the important things for white people, and most of us are, there are also Jews who are not white. There are Black Jews and brown Jews, Jews of color. One of the things to recognize is that when we have white skin privilege, which Ashkenazi Jews do, the vast majority of Black people will not agree with Eric Ward.
Right.
So it's fantastic, and I love him, but the vast majority of the world will
Right.
say that Jews are actually really white.
Right.
Part of what happened, I don't know how much you said, so I'll just say a couple of things. In the United States, until around 1950, Jews and Irish people and Italian people were not considered white. We were other. We were part of the brown people, you know, and it was only through our advancement, usually through civil service jobs. So Jews often became teachers, maybe accountants, and Irish people became cops, and the Italian people became cops too. You know? So it was like when we elevated our economic status, kind of slightly, maybe it was working class, but better than being working in the sweatshops in the garment industry, slaving away for 12 hours a day. As we developed economically, we kind of moved out of that brown category. So there literally was a different category for us. And
Like
now, go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say, what do you mean, like legislatively and immigration books, and that's what when you say literally a different category? So you mean? Or you just mean more of like a socially constructed way?
Socially constructed. So just like there were country clubs where you could have no Black people, right, you could have no Jews, right? And just like there were universities where you could, you know, you couldn't get in if you were Black, you couldn't get in if you were Jewish, right? So it wasn't so much the legislation didn't protect us as white people.
Right.
That's what I would say. It's not like there was a law that said Jews are brown.
Right. Yeah, I would say, with regard to Eric Ward's comment, I would say Jews are mostly white, but sometimes not white, by which I just mean if we're having a conversation where we're talking about white nationalism and how we're viewed by people who commonly hate Black people and Jewish people, we are not white in the context of that conversation.
That's absolutely right.
But for all intents and purposes, in terms of when we are talking about the situation of African Americans in our country and what's going on in our at this moment in our national life, I think it makes a lot of sense to view ourselves when Jews have those Jews who have white skin to view themselves as being white in that context. So in other words, it's too simple of a label to say we're always X or always Y.
I frequently quote Eric, you know, anti-Semitism animates white nationalism. And so as far as white nationalists are concerned, all of us should be dead.
Right.
All of us should be dead. That's what they want.
Right.
What I would say about our off-whiteness is that we should be the best allies and accomplices because we should have a higher level of empathy already hardwired into our system.
Right.
Because our whiteness is so very recent in this country, and our extermination and experience of genocide is so recent in our epigenetic code and in our families.
Yeah. By the way, did you say oft white, like OFT white?
OFF.
Oh, okay. That's why I left. That is what I thought you said. That's exactly what we are. We're off white. So, you know, I'll tell you something that one thing that's always struck me is that, well, I alluded to it earlier, you know, growing up in America, in a culture that felt to me very materialistic and very like misguided, I always had the sense of like, you know, just this knowledge in my bones that like the way that so many Jews I know live, like this just ain't right. Like, you know, this is not I'm not feeling like the yearning for equality in the eyes of God, and I'm not hearing us like follow the prophet Isaiah and Jeremiah here. I'm not feeling it. And I think that because of the ascent of the Jewish people in the American social ladder, economically speaking and socially speaking, and social respectability and privilege and all of the things that this country has granted the Jewish people, that I think that we have over many decades, especially since the middle of the 20th century, really become white in problematic ways, in ways that has often distanced us from an understanding of what's going on to vulnerable people in our country. But what's so fascinating is what resonates with me more than it ever did before is the particular trajectory of Moshe, Dafka precisely coming from the center of power. The fact that Moshe was not just some dude who like awakened to the plight of his people and embraced them and like kind of led them, but came from the center of power, came from the house of Pharaoh, the center of the source of the problem, socially speaking. And then from there really put his life on the line to stand in solidarity with the oppressed, I think makes him a totally compelling figure to me in ways that I had never seen before when I was first learning about Moshe. Like, that part of his story was kind of less relevant. It added to his courage. It added to his ability to kind of empathize when it wasn't in his self-interest. But I think at this moment in our culture, that aspect of the Moshe story is so compelling to me.
Yeah, I also want to say that in addition to the category of Jew that has become materialistic and assimilated and, ensconced in the power, in the temples of power, there's also an incredible overrepresentation of Jews in the labor movement, in the environmental movement, in every radical left movement, in the socialist movement. Wild overrepresentation of Jews. And so I think there's an awful lot of us who are living Torah values and not pursuing the materialistic path. I also want to say about Moshe Rabbeinu, and you'll never have me here again, but I hope this doesn't disturb anyone, but I think it would be remiss for me, as somebody who's been out in the streets 7 or 8 times now at the Justice Center, watching the police initiate violence against protesters who maybe shake a fence or throw a bottle at nobody, or scale a fence and do no harm. And the police are using flashbangs and they're beating people with batons, and they were using tear gas, now they're using pepper spray and firing rubber bullets. That this moment where the protesters are being cast as the problem and the police are being cast by some as legitimately responding to violence of the protesters is really disturbing. So first of all, it's just not true, and I want you all to know it's not true. In my secular life, I run an organization called Portland United Against Hate, and we have a tool, a reporting instrument where people, which until this moment has been used for people to report racist or homophobic or xenophobic incidents, so we could get a sense of the scope of hate violence and hate in the city. But we've asked people to chronicle their experiences with police brutality, and we got over 35 responses in 4 days.
Yeah.
And those responses are representing the experience of thousands of people. So that's the first thing I want to say. Now I want to say, and even beyond that, this is also June and it's Pride Month, and everybody thinks Stonewall was great. So what do you think happened at Stonewall? But a black and a brown trans woman threw a brick, or maybe it was a stone, at the police. And what else do you think happened? There were Molotov cocktails being made in the moment, firebombs being thrown at the police. There was a rebellion. And nobody today thinks, oh, I wish Stonewall didn't happen. Why did they have to get violent? Oh, property damage never does anything.
Right.
So even if there were some fires in garbage cans, and even if somebody threw a water bottle made out of plastic and it hit a cop, I just am here to say it does not justify what the police are doing.
Right.
Back to Torah,
Right.
Moshe Rabbeinu killed, the slave master, right?
Yeah. Right.
He is not punished by Yah for that.
Right.
He is punished later in our story for getting mad and hitting a rock, right?
Mm-hmm.
So to me, what this teaches is that righteous defense against the power and violence of empire is legitimate.
Right.
And
that's so powerful.
anger in the face, otherwise, is not legitimate.
Right. Right. That I find that very powerful. You sort of apologized on the front end in case anybody's offended. I can't speak for anybody else. But I'm not offended by that. I think I think it's interesting. I will say, I got into a conversation with people right after the election on Facebook, after the 2016 election, when there were all these stories about Antifa coming up, and in particular, the only part of Antifa that people were focusing on were these violent acts against right-wing nationalists and white supremacists, and in general, I'm afraid of mob violence. In general, as a Jew, I'm very suspicious of mob violence because it often goes badly. And for Jews and in particular, but I also have to agree with what you're saying, and I think that when we always view that the violence through the lens of the people in power, that is, and whether it's the police or whether somebody else, then I do think that we are distorting parts of our own tradition. And also, by the way, just forget the Jewish tradition, just the American. If you look at American history and you look
the
at
revolution,
right, right. That's why the country exists, is as an independent nation. So I guess I'm ambivalent. I'm ambivalent about it because of the ways that the spirit of the season can change, and one person's righteous violence is another person's brutality. So I'm ambivalent, but I'm deeply moved by what you're saying and how you're viewing it in terms of Moses' story in particular. I can't disagree with it. We're getting to the point where we need to wrap up, and
we do have another question.
Okay, let's close on this question, and then Rabbi, I'll give you kind of the closing word in case there's anything you want to say, and then I'll wrap us up. What's our
I would
question?
like to ask a quick question after this.
Okay,
please,
let's take this one and then Lenny. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So Rob asks in the chat, how is it Jews are generally not viewed as minorities?
I think we are viewed as a minority in terms of the numbers in the population, but the question is probably, why are we not viewed as targeted or vulnerable minorities, or as a group that doesn't have access to resources and is discriminated against? And I think that's because we became white.
Right.
But
right.
That's really, really recent. It's still in our memory. It's still in our epigenetic code when we were absolutely violently targeted.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great answer, and Rob Sturtz, that's a really good question. I think that what comes up for me is that the word minority is multivalent. I hadn't really thought about this until you asked this question. But sometimes by minority we mean it in the simplest sense. We mean it numerically. And clearly Jews are a minority, but I think on the average American day, the average day in America, many Jews are not minority in the sense that we're not marginalized. I'm talking about North America on the average day. I'm not talking about worldwide. I'm not talking about rampant anti-Semitism in parts of the world. I'm not talking about Israel or anything except on an average day in the United States. And so sometimes I think by the word minority, we mean a group that doesn't have access to political power, political agency, institutions of higher education, presence in the professions, political power, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm oversimplifying because obviously there are many ways in which Jews still are marginalized and still are outsiders, but that's my best answer. The word minority is just a complicated word.
I do want to add that anti-Semitism everywhere, including in the United States, is skyrocketing, and it's not just the Poway Synagogue and the Tree of Life Synagogue. It's skyrocketing, and it's especially online. So, and yet, the average Black wealth and household wealth in this country is almost nothing. That is not true of Jews.
Right.
You know,
That's right.
and what we have, the systematic racism, which I consider slow genocide that we have perpetrated against Black people in this country, is nothing like what Jews have experienced.
Right. Thank you.
Nothing that Jews have experienced in this country, right? Right? Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, I said it's nothing like Jews have experienced in this country, maybe in other countries, right, where they were just systematically killed. But that wasn't my question. And just want to point out that Bob Dylan said, like, what, 50, 60 years ago, it isn't he or she or them or it that you belong to. He had a long vision into the future. But now, just wrap it up, is that what you see is the relationship. You know, I used to only go to Orthodox shuls, and then I'd get invited for Friday night dinner, and they'd start laughing about what Rush Limbaugh had discussed that day, and they were going to look in there supporting Ted Cruz. And I would say, and it ended up that really I couldn't go out to dinner. Do you see any kind of relationship between like fundamentalist ideology in your religion and, you know, their republicanism and all of that? Do you see any kind of relationship there? I
do. And those who are studying the Trump phenomena say that there's a certain neurological construct, a certain portion of the population that finds itself compelled by authoritarianism. And so I think that the mental construct that likes to be told what to do is more likely to be found in fundamentalist environments of all religions. So I do think that there's a connection between.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, I want to say, I mean, everybody in my congregation knows that I really have no use for Donald Trump, and I'm more than that. I'm you know, I find the guy to be dangerous and noxious. But I also want to say that I have people in my congregation who are supporters of Donald Trump, and I just think that the phenomenon is more complicated than what you just said. I'm not disagreeing with what has been discovered or anything like that, but in my conversation with folks like that, I do think it's slightly more complicated. To me, it doesn't make it less troubling because, as I said, I'm pretty unequivocal about.
Well, I understand what they're saying. Right-wing authoritarian governments have always been very protective of the Jews in the country. So, right? Shouldn't.
Right. I hear you. So. One other thing, this is a little bit now moot, but I just wanted to go on record and just say, because so I had talked about the connection of my Jewish experience and people who were had sort of made it socially and financially and economically, and there was a sort of materialism that characterized it. I was not trying to say that is the Jewish world, bichlal. I was just acknowledging what you said is absolutely true. I was talking about my experience in a certain corner of the Jewish world and how it shaped my own thinking. So I want to say that I love talking to you, and I could do this for like another couple hours, but I'm so grateful to you for carving out time for this and for your open-hearted and curiosity and your the way that you live your Jewish values. And I think you're such an incredibly valuable source of teaching and of lived Jewish values in our city. So I'm so grateful to you for that as well. I want to thank everybody for joining us, and I hope everybody has a beautiful night. Rabbi Kolodny, anything you want to say in closing?
Stay healthy, stay safe.
All right.
Or,
Words to
Sei
live.
gesund.
Words to live by. Jemmy, anything that we need to announce as from the staff?
Well, this has been recorded and will be up in our archives on our YouTube channel. So if people didn't get to stay for the whole time or didn't get to attend, we'll be able to share it later. But this was a wonderful discussion, and thank you both rabbis for arranging a beautiful night so some of us could sit outside while we're enjoying.
All right,
Thank you
everybody.
for having me.
Thank you so much. Take care. It was fun.